Today I am installing Eibach lowering springs on this 2025 BMW G20 M340i xDrive. This is an LCI2 model. It has just over 200 miles on the odometer, thus it is brand new. For those interested, I did a hoist review on this vehicle. That video is available on this channel. As for the springs themselves, I just opened the box, which has been sitting in my garage for a couple of months now. The price for these is around $350 US, add in tax and possibly shipping, so you're something below $400 for a set of these. Although I purchased these through Tire Rack, they're available from a number of suppliers. I will include the part numbers in the video description. So the question is, why did I choose Eibach lowering springs over other choices in the marketplace? And it comes down to two goals I have for this project. One is a modest drop. I'm not looking for a slammed look. I'm not looking for maximum lowering, fender against the top edge of the tire. And I also don't want to risk scraping the front end of the vehicle at every possible curb or parking block or what have you. I want a minimal drop. That is goal number one. Goal number two is to retain as much of the factory ride quality or compliancy as possible. And when you look at like H&R and Dine-In and those other choices, Bilstein, etc., those tend to be a little bit rougher. I'm not looking for that. I want lowered look, better handling, factory ride or near factory ride quality and compliancy. And from prior experience, the Eibach springs will deliver that. I do have experience installing H&R springs as well as Bilstein springs, Bilstein coilovers, KW coilovers. I've been down those paths. I understand what each of those provides in terms of lowering and ride quality. And for my money and for what I'm trying to do, Eibach is the best choice. For those unfamiliar with my channel, I have one rule in that I do all of my own work, and once I take possession of a vehicle, it will never see the dealer throughout its entire service life. This vehicle, it's never going to the dealer for anything, with the exception of some type of unforeseen recall where I can't do the work myself or I can't get access to the parts, etc. I did have a recall on this F90 M5 competition, and I did that myself. Moving ahead, this vehicle is fully loaded. It has every option and option package available from the factory. Thus, it does have an adaptive suspension. There are some things you have to do when performing installation of lowering springs on a vehicle like this. They're not major, they're minor. There's just subtle differences to doing an install on this vehicle versus one with a standard suspension. So I will touch on those items as we proceed through the project. In terms of setting expectations, this is not a detailed every nut and bolt, every turn of the wrench video. I will touch on the highlights and the things that are important to you. We will begin at the rear of the vehicle. I have removed the rear wheels. I've also disconnected the battery. In the trunk, you're going to need a wedge tool, as our friends at BMW have removed the pull tab from this cover or lid. And there we have the 12-volt AGM BMW battery. So in this case, I have disconnected the negative terminal. I've placed it aside. I've wrapped it in a microfiber towel, and we are good to go. The question now is, why are we disconnecting the battery when doing a lowering spring project? And the answer is the active suspension. We will not be disconnecting the rear shocks. However, the front struts will require disconnecting to install the new springs, and that is why we're doing this. We don't want any error codes or anything strange coming up after the install. Something else to think about, if you have a power lift gate and you intend to latch the trunk lid, and I do, as I don't want the trunk making contact with the ceiling as the vehicle is raised and lowered, you'll want to lower the rear seats on the passenger side. That gives you access to the emergency trunk release located here. Yes, you can reach through the center section, which can be released, but it's just easier to do this ahead of time. Otherwise, you will not be able to get into the trunk, something that I've learned on prior projects. Let's move ahead. Okay, folks, in this checkpoint, we're going to go over the items that need to be loosened or disconnected in preparation for removal of the rear springs. We'll start up high and work down low. I have light bars in place on each side to add light on video, and we'll get started. First of all, the anti-roll bar. You can see this is way up high now that it's disconnected. It's held in place with a 16mm nut. You'll need a T30 Torx for counteracting force to hold that stem in place to back that nut off, and just get this out of the way when you're done. One of the things that really surprised me is that this sway bar end link is nylon, plastic, ABS, whatever it's made out of. I was really kind of shocked that this is that material. I was expecting aluminum or steel or something like that, not plastic. Now I understand there's not a lot of tension and this is a very thin bar. In all respects, this is a relatively small sway bar, but I've never seen this material used on a sway bar end link on any BMW for the past 25 plus years. As far as these lines, this is the wheel speed sensor. This has been disconnected from this bracket, as well as the wire for the active suspension. Now, I don't believe this will need to be disconnected because the shock is not coming out of the vehicle. The shock will uncompress a little bit if it's not already at its furthest point. So as you can see, there's plenty of play in this wire. That should not be a problem. Now, working down from there, each of these bolts have been loosened. Okay, and let's move down to the camber adjustment arm. That's what BMW calls this. I call it the lower control arm. You have the shock mount bolt here on the bottom. This is 18mm and 18mm. And then you have this actual, again, lower control arm or camber adjustment arm mounting bolt, and that is 21mm, and that's an E20 Torx. So you're gonna need an E20 socket or an E20 wrench, whichever you have. That should work fine. And I've loosened these, I've obviously not removed them. In the next checkpoint, I'll go over what it takes to raise this up a little bit, put some tension on it, and get these to back out. Backing each of these out and lowering this, taking tension off the spring, that's probably the most tedious part of the job. And now let's go over to the driver's side, and the difference over here is we have this level sensor. So BMW has actually changed the level sensor connector. It was a plastic push pin. Now we're looking at a 10mm nut on this end and a 9mm holder on the inside. So you're looking at a 10mm nut on the end and a 9mm on the inside for counteracting force to get that disconnected. Or if you want to just pop these pins out and get that bracket off of this, again, lower control arm, aka camber adjustment arm, you can do that. Or you can take the whole bracket off if you want. It's just easy to take this nut off and drop it down out of the way. So on this side of the vehicle, all the same things apply. Each of these cables are disconnected from the bracket. The sway bar end link is disconnected, and each of the fasteners on the bottom here, again, this is the shock mount bolt, 18mm on both sides, 21mm on this camber control arm bolt, and E20 Torx on this end. BMW recommends that you renew each of these fasteners. However, this is a brand new vehicle. It has just over 200 miles showing, and I'm going to reuse these fasteners for that reason. They are steel, they're not aluminum, they're not stretch bolts, and yeah, it shouldn't be a problem. In terms of removing each of these fasteners, be aware that this nut will be the tightest. It has the highest torque spec. We'll get into torque specs later during reassembly. This nut was very easy to remove, whereas this nut was somewhat of a challenge. Okay, this is the last step in preparation for removal of the rear springs. Keep in mind you will need something to raise the lower control arm, aka the camber adjustment arm. You're going to raise it slightly to take tension off of the mounting bolts for both the shock and the spindle, where that control arm mounts to the spindle. And once the mounting bolts are removed, you will slowly lower the control arm to decompress the spring. And you want to take caution when doing that. Seeing as that I am using a lift, I am using this under hoist jack stand to accomplish this. If you're doing this project using jack stands, you can use a floor jack to accomplish the same thing, or a scissor jack, whatever you have at your disposal. Keep in mind you will want to place something between the jack stand and the lower control arm to protect the control arm. Again, this is painted, it's thin stamped steel. If scratched or scuffed, it will rust, so you want to prevent that. As far as what I'm using, that's a piece of baler belt. You can use a double piece of cardboard, an old scrap of carpeting, whatever you have at your disposal. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the mounting bolts, get the spring out, and we'll take another checkpoint. Here on the floor, we have the original factory spring and the replacement from Eibach, including the upper and lower spring mounts. I've laid these on the floor as evenly as possible to show the height difference. In terms of the windings themselves, it is a difference of 14.25 millimeters for the factory spring and 15 millimeters even for the Eibach spring. So the spring is a little bit thicker and the windings are 6 on the left and 8 on the right. It's going to be a little bit stiffer ride, but it should provide the drop that I'm looking for without going too far. Next step is to get the mount switched over to the new spring and then get the spring in the vehicle and get everything buttoned up. There is a possibility that I will have to loosen the upper shock mount to get the shock to align and to get the mounting bolt back in place, but we'll see if that's actually necessary. BMW TIS calls that out as a need to do, but we'll see if that's actually necessary. Moving on. The new spring is installed and both of the mounting bolts are back in place, although loosely. We'll come back to those in a moment. Let's take a look at the spring. Now, the writing on the spring coils itself, the brand name, the model number, and all of that should be right side up. And as you look up to the top of the spring should be in the rubber upper mount correctly, meaning that this right here, the edge of the spring, it should be matching with the mount itself. On the bottom, that's hard to see from any angle, but suffice to say I did line it up correctly, and you want to make sure that this rubber stud is sticking through and that the coil itself or the spring itself is lining up with the rubber mount, and I have done that. Now let's talk about the mounting bolts. This is where many videos fail or they skip over things that are challenges off camera, and I think it's worthy to mention this. Okay, so the shock mount bolt, it went in very easily. That is, as I raised up the lower control arm, it lined up perfectly, no problem. And there was no reason to loosen the top shock mount bolts, which is something that's called out on the BMW TIS service information. You do not have to loosen those. However, this bolt was a problem in that it lined up perfectly on this side. However, it did not pass through cleanly on this side. It wasn't a big deal. It was a matter of the control arm was pushed in that direction, maybe half the width of the bolt, and I just had to do some levering with a wedge tool to allow those to line up, and it passed through with no problem. If you're doing this on the ground on jack stands, that might be a real challenge if you come upon something like this, but having the vehicle in the air like this, it was a little bit easier for me. It was something that took me a few minutes to provide a solution and get this matched up. To complete this side of the vehicle, I will be raising this to ride height or near ride height. What does that mean? Well, we'll raise it up high enough that the vehicle will almost come off of this jack pad, meaning it will be loose or slightly loose. And there's no reason to push matters and raise it up too high because the vehicle could cavitate and fall off the lift. We're going to raise it up enough, it compresses the spring and everything. Then we will tighten each of these to their proper torque, and I'll come back and talk about that momentarily. Okay folks, the driver's side rear is now fully reassembled. Everything is torqued properly with the exception of the sway bar end link and the sway bar itself. They are detached for the moment until we complete the passenger side. I will do those at that time. And the cables are back in the standoff. You do not have to remove these. I did that as a precaution, but there's sufficient slack here that those cables are never under stress. In fact, I don't think they moved very much during the process. Now, working our way around, the level sensor is back in place. It's reconnected. Everything looks good there. and let's talk about the mounting bolts. First up is the shock bolt, which is 100 Newton meters or 74 foot-pounds, and then the main carrier bolt that is 165 Newton meters or 123 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the passenger side. We'll get that started, and I expect the process to be much the same, except for there's no level sensor on that side, but otherwise it should be pretty straightforward. We'll get into that now. Okay folks, the passenger side rear spring is removed. I have the factory original placed on the floor next to the Eibach lowering spring replacement. The program on this side is very much the same as it was on the driver's side. Nothing different, nothing whatsoever. I am including this as oftentimes videos skip over one side or you feel like you've missed something, and it's exactly the same operation in terms of removal of fasteners, removal of the spring, and installing of the spring. I find it interesting that the lower spring perch is as dirty as it is on a brand new vehicle. Nevertheless, that's the way it looks. On the older models, going back a couple of generations, E36, E46, these were a problem as water would collect and it would rust the bottom of the spring. The spring would eventually fail. So hopefully that's not the situation with this vehicle. We'll move on. The rear springs are now fully installed and everything's back in place, properly torqued, properly tightened. We'll take a look at a couple things here real quick, turn on some light, spin around, and let's get a look at the springs themselves. Okay, you can see, once again, you can see the writing on the springs, which is right side up, and it's facing the differential. Over on this side, it's much the same story. The writing is face up, facing the differential. The only thing of mention with this part of the project, that is, it was a slight challenge, was lining up the rear carrier for the bolts to go back in place. Not so much an issue on the shock, but definitely on the outboard carrier bolts or spindle bolts, whatever you want to call those. It's the ball joint connection. That will be somewhat of a challenge. Otherwise, everything went back together as it should, and there were no major issues. I'm going to put the rear wheels back on the vehicle, and we're going to move to the front of the vehicle for the second part of this project. Now that the rear springs are fully installed, we transition to the front of the vehicle. I have removed the driver's side wheel, placed it aside, and the vehicle is now elevated. I will go over considerations for removal of the front strut and further considerations for xDrive models, such as the vehicle that I am working on. I've also loosened a number of items, which I will go over individually, and we'll jump into that straight away. First up is the active suspension itself. We will need to disconnect the front strut as well as the G sensor on this side. It's very simple, and like I said, these are already loosened, but you push this tab in, pull straight out. It's one of the cleaner, nicer connections that I've seen from BMW, and I know many of their suppliers are responsible for the connectors, but sometimes they fight you and give you all kinds of fits, and these are real nice. They come out cleanly. As far as this sensor, this is held in place with an E11 E-Torx. Simply remove this and pull straight out. Place that aside. You don't want to damage that during removal of the strut or installation of the new spring. Something to point out on this strut are all of the additional metal standoffs, such as the cable standoff here, the cable standoff here, the one on the back. This is not used on the M340i, and of course you've got this standoff here as well for the sensor. You've got a lot of metal fixtures that are in the way and to be aware of when removing the strut as well as reinstalling it. I've already pulled these cables off of the standoffs. I'm going to continue to disconnect things, work my way around the strut, and keep moving. Now I'm going to remove the strut in a very conservative manner, and I'll explain what that entails. First of all, I'm going to loosen the front hydro bearing or hydro bushing. This actually consists of a single bolt that goes into a nut that's in the frame or the subframe of the vehicle. So I'm going to loosen but not remove that. Same goes for the lower control arm. That's a nut and bolt here. I will not be removing it. I'll just be loosening it. I'll also be disconnecting the level sensor, and I'll also be disconnecting the sway bar end link. Those are the items at minimum you should remove when doing this project. I see a lot of videos and DIYs where people, they don't do that, and it's a tremendous mistake because you're placing a lot of pressure on the hydro bushing as well as the lower control arm bushing. And of course, this vehicle is brand new. It's not such a big deal, but it only takes a few minutes to do those items, and you're relieving a lot of stress when doing this operation. I will go ahead and do each of these operations and we'll move forward. As a quick checkpoint, I have performed initial disassembly, focusing on the items previously mentioned. The sway bar end link is disconnected. The level sensor is disconnected. Back on this side, the thrust arm bushing or hydro bushing is loosened, and the lower control arm bushing as it connects to the subframe or forward carrier is also loosened. To access the mounting bolt for the thrust arm bushing, you will need to remove this triangular panel, and I've also removed this plastic piece, which is new on the G20. It was not on the F30, E90, E46, or E36, but it's a new plastic panel that they've placed in this space. I have both of those panels that you'll need to remove here on the floor. As we approach removal of the front strut, it is important to understand the differences between the xDrive or all-wheel drive models versus rear-wheel drive or non-xDrive variants. The major obvious difference is the front axle. In this case, we've got the mounting bolt here, the axle itself shown here, and the problem is on the xDrive models, you have less range of motion. That is the up and down movement of this assembly once the strut is disconnected. So once I loosen the pinch bolt on the strut mount itself, this will drop down. However, you only have so much, again, range of motion. This will only lower so much. On the rear-wheel drive models where there's no axle involved, this will drop down lower, and thus it's easier to remove the strut from rear-wheel drive models. But in this case, you've got the axle to deal with. There are a number of things you can do. Obviously, you could disassemble everything. You could take the caliper, the rotor, you could disconnect the axle, you could disconnect the tie rod. There are lots of different ways to approach this. However, I'm doing this in the most conservative manner, in a manner that I've done it before, and it always works. I don't have any issues with stressing bushings or damaging anything along this journey. I'm going to take the next step, which will be under the hood of the vehicle. We're going to disconnect the strut at the top, at the strut tower itself. Now I say disconnect, I'll remove all but maybe one of the mounting bolts. I think there's 4 of them on this model. We'll remove 3 of those. We'll leave 1 in place, and then we'll come down here, we'll loosen the pinch bolt. We'll start to move this assembly down. I'll make sure that this is supported, and then we'll go ahead and get the strut out of the vehicle. We are now up top, and I have removed a couple of plastic pieces to access the front strut tower. The first is the cover for the new drive-by-wire master cylinder. You can remove that by hand. This item here goes in this position, and it's held in place with 4 plastic push-pin style connectors. So you'll want to remove those, place those aside, and then we get to the strut tower itself. This is a very different arrangement from prior generations, such as the F30, E90, E46, E36 3 Series. They have greatly reinforced this, and they were kind of on the path to doing this in the F30 generation, but they've taken it even further. So the top strut mount is much smaller. It takes fewer mounting bolts. In this case, there are only 4. As stated earlier, I intended to remove 3 of 4 fasteners. However, in this case, I've elected to leave 2 in place. So these 2 are removed, these 2 remain in place. These have been loosened, but not fully, and this has actually dropped down just a little bit. Doing this will provide some movement in the strut. When I'm working down below and I loosen the pinch bolt and I start to move the assembly downward, it will allow this to pivot just a little bit, and that will make a big difference when removing this. We'll get that disconnected down below. We'll get everything supported. We'll come back up here, remove these bolts, and then pull the assembly out of the vehicle. To pick up where we left off, and as shown, I have taken one additional step prior to removal of the pinch bolt from the strut mount. That is, I have disconnected the tie rod. This is not absolutely necessary, but for me, I find that it allows for the wheel to turn easier. Obviously, you're not fighting against the electric power steering rack, and also it provides a little more rake in and out as you're doing that. It's good to have a little bit more added mobility, and it only takes a couple minutes to remove this. So I've taken that step, as well as supporting the driver's side front suspension with this underhoist jack stand. I can raise and lower this as needed. As shown above, the pinch bolt is removed. I have a caliper spreader back here, and that relieves pressure on this mount. And as shown, I've got a little bit of movement here. I almost have the strut completely free of the strut mount. I will lower this down a little bit further, get this separated, then I will go above and disconnect the two bolts that remain in place while holding this underneath, and then I can just gently remove it. As shown, there's no scarring. There's nothing that was under stress when doing this. This is the cleanest and most conservative way to do this. Also, take note that the axle is not under stress. The boots or the axle itself, those are perfectly fine. And something I should mention as well, on the driver's side, the axle is the same length as the axle on the passenger side. It wasn't always like that. If you go back in time on the F30s and E90s, etc., those were of a different length. And usually on the passenger side, it was easier to do this operation. But now, the way that the axles are made today, they're equidistant, so they're equally difficult on each side. The driver's side front strut is now removed from the vehicle, and let's take a quick look at a few things before moving on. The strut body, or the bottom here where it goes into the mount, it came out cleanly. It's not all scarred up. I'm happy with that. In terms of the fixtures, again, there are several cable standoffs and brackets on the body of this strut. We've got the active suspension mount here, and we have this bracket, which is actually for vehicles with run flat tires. There is a dampening coil that goes into this position. It's the shape of a donut. It helps to reduce NVH for vehicles with run flat tires. Thank goodness we're not dealing with that here. In terms of working our way up the strut, this skirt, or whatever it's referred to, is rather large. If you are compressing springs with certain types of spring compressors, this will get in the way. The spring itself, as shown, has very few coils, and when it's uncompressed, it expands greatly. The spring that will take its place, the shorter spring, has more coils. I'm going to measure and see how thick the coils are exactly, but it will not compress and decompress as much. And then working our way up to the shock mount itself, I really like this design. We've got 4 mounting bolts, and we've got the 2 guide pins. It's very straightforward. It's much more simple than the F30 shock mount or shock bearing, whichever you want to call it. Take note, there is an indexing mark here. So there's a white mark here that goes up onto the shock mount itself, and you want to make sure that those are aligned when reassembling this. We're going to put this in a spring compressor, take the next step, get the factory spring out, and get the new spring in. Before we do that, we're going to do a quick comparison to an F30 strut. I have one available from a project that I'd like to show, and we'll look at that now. I now have driver's side front struts side by side from the G20 and F30 platforms. We just reviewed the strut on the right. Let's take a look at the strut on the left. Obviously, this is somewhat of an apples to oranges comparison, as the strut on the left is from a standard suspension, not an active suspension, and that is a Bilstein OEM replacement. However, the rest of the strut is stock and from the factory. Taking a look at the lower skirt area here, this is rubber. It doesn't extend out as far as this, which is metal. And also the springs themselves, take note that the F30 spring has maybe 1 additional coil as compared to the G20. And as stated before, I expect this spring to expand greatly. These typically expand a great deal, but I'm expecting even more from this one. And let's take a look up the strut further on top. And this is where the major differences exist. On the F30, the face of the shock mount or shock bearing, whichever you choose to call it, this is much bigger. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mounting bolts. This one is actually a dummy. The guide pins are much shorter, and we have a mount here for the strut bar, which runs diagonally from the strut mount over to the firewall on F30 vehicles. It's a very different design. And the other thing to point out is the strut on the G20 is just a little bit taller, and it's not the floor or the angle of the camera. It's actually, yeah, it's just a little bit taller than the F30. Those are the major differences between these, and I wanted to call out those. The other thing to point out on the lower strut body are how fewer fixtures there are on the F30. Now, once again, the strut on the left is from a standard suspension. The one on the right is active suspension, so you're not going to see the connector there. I find this interesting, and we're going to take the next step. Okay, with the strut removed, let's now take a look at the strut tower from below. And we've got the 4 mounting bolt positions, and then we have the 2 guide pin positions, and they are guide pins because these are like small funnels. They literally guide the strut mount into position, which I really like. And this is an all aluminum design. It's much thicker, it's much more durable and stout than the F30 and prior generations of the 3 Series. This is a really nice job, especially considering some of the strut tower issues that BMW has had in the past, especially in the rear, not so much in the front, but nevertheless, this is a very nice look. And as shown, everything here is supported. Nothing is stressed. All the cables, everything is loose. The axle, yeah, everything looks good. I'm not concerned whatsoever with any of this. I've done many of these before in this manner. Something else worthy of mention, which I did not cover on the hoist review video for this vehicle, and that is the extensive use of aluminum in the front structure. Now, we've talked about the aluminum strut tower and how the design changed for that. However, as you work your way down and you get into what I would call the frame rails here, or the forward structure of the vehicle, it is entirely aluminum. At a glance, I thought this was aluminum bonded to steel, but it's actually all aluminum. So to BMW's credit, they have engineered a fully aluminum forward structure, which is great to see. On the 5 Series, this occurred in the transition between the E39 and the E60, where the E60 had a fully front aluminum structure. But it's great to see that the 3 Series is now catching up in this regard. Again, I'm still a critic of the rear steel subframe and the stamped steel control arms at the rear of the vehicle. Hopefully in the G50 generation, the next generation of this platform, they will finally do something about the rear portion of the structure and they'll go full aluminum. We'll see if that happens. This is a part of the video which is often omitted on DIY instructionals, in that I have a decision point. In terms of removal of the spring from the strut, do I use the tried and true freestanding McPherson strut compressor? That's the red and black device on the floor. Or do I use hand spring compressors, which are in the black case? The situation is the active suspension strut is actually thicker or larger in diameter and will not go into this freestanding spring compressor. The bottom of it will, but just barely, and it looks like the strut could become stuck in the spring compressor, which would be a major problem. For that reason, I'm leaning towards the hand spring compressor, but I'd really like to use the tried and true method. As shown, I am using the hand spring compressors, and they are working well. This is the style I'm using. There are other styles. I got the Harbor Freight, Craftsman, and I forget what this is, Chinese something. This is doing the job, and as shown, the shock mount is now loose. There's no tension on this. So as I back the nut out, there will be no issues with this flying apart or injuring me or damaging something. So we'll take the next step and get this fully disassembled. The factory spring is now removed from the driver's side front strut. On the left, we have the factory spring. On the right, we have the Eibach lowering spring. As expected, the factory spring is a little bit taller than the lowering spring, and it's leaning to one side, which is normal. When uncompressed, factory springs do not stand up straight. Again, this is normal. What is interesting is the manner in which the coils are arranged. So if you look at the factory spring, starting from the bottom, we have 1, 2, 3, not quite 4 coils. On the replacement spring from Eibach, we have, starting at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4 plus, almost 4¼ coils on this spring. So they've chosen to go with a longer spring. But to further make things interesting, on the factory spring, this is a measurement, a thickness of about 13.9 to 14 millimeters. And over here we have a solid 13.7 throughout the diameter of the entire spring. It's interesting on the factory spring because it varies a little bit as you work your way down. It gets a little bit thicker and then a little bit thinner. For what reason, I don't know. It could be just the paint, or maybe the actual metal is thicker, but suffice to say, we're looking at about 0.2 to 0.3 of a millimeter thinner coils on the Eibach spring. This is exactly what I'm targeting, in that I'm looking for a compliant factory-like ride. I want the lower stance, I want the better handling, but I don't necessarily want a rough ride. This is the approach that Eibach has taken. They've downsized the thickness of the coil itself just slightly, and I'm sure that the spring rate is very similar to the factory piece. This is effectively what we're looking at. The next step will be installing the new spring on the strut. We'll get into that momentarily. With regard to reassembly of the strut, it was very straightforward. I don't like to use the word easy, however in this case it was, in that I did not have to use the spring compressors. With the shorter spring, I was able to put everything together, stand the strut up straight, as I'll do now, and then with hand strength press down, and I was able to get the nut started on the pistons. I wasn't able to compress it entirely by hand, but enough to get the nut on the threads to get that started, and that made this a very straightforward process. It worked out beautifully, and we're now in a position to reinstall the strut in the vehicle, and we'll move on to that now. We are now back at the vehicle, and if there is one takeaway from this video, this will definitely be it. When you're reinstalling the strut in the vehicle, make sure that you hang the strut first. At this point, it's held in place with 2 mounting bolts, and those are loosely in place, which allows the strut to move. And that is exactly what you want. You want to be able to move this assembly, to move the strut, to rejoin them. You're not going to scar this up or cause any damage to anything, and nothing here is stressed. See, we still have some movement in the tie rod, and all of this is still moving, so that's good. Nothing's being stressed. There's no stress on the cables or the wires or anything. This is the proper way to do an xDrive or an all-wheel drive variant of these vehicles, and it will save a lot of trouble and headaches as you're trying to get this reassembled. Okay folks, everything is reassembled but not properly torqued, meaning it's snug, it's held in place, but it has not been properly tightened. I will review all of the respective torque settings for each of the fasteners, but first let's talk about how this went back together. Again, it was just a matter of patience, placing the bottom of the strut into the strut brace, and then once those were aligned, just raising up this under hoist jack stand, and it worked smoothly, perfectly, no issues. As you can see, no scarring, denting, or scuffing of the bottom of the strut itself. It all worked out beautifully. I'm very happy with that. I did make one mistake, and that is regarding the wheel speed sensor cable. As I was putting things back together, the wheel speed sensor cable is this right here. We're going to go around on this side, and I have since corrected this. I actually had this cable wrapped around the other side, coming down between the bottom of the strut and the boot, which was a recipe for disaster. I simply backed out the wheel speed sensor, and it took about 2 to 3 minutes to correct that minor infraction. Nevertheless, everything is as it should be. And just to go over things, we've got the sway bar end link connected. We've got the tie rod back in place. We have the level sensor in place. And of course, we have the pinch bolt back in place. I will now go over the respective torque settings for each of the fasteners. Keep in mind that BMW revises these from time to time. The specifications that I'm providing on video could change, thus use these at your own risk. I will now review the torque specifications for each respective fastener. I'm going to go over all of the fasteners on this assembly, whether they were part of this project or not, as some of you may take things a little bit further, or you may cut corners, what have you. Nevertheless, let's start with the tie rod right here. That is 165 Newton meters, no offset torque. the upper control arm or thrust arm, should you remove that, the inner ball joint here on that arm is 175 Newton meters, no offset torque. The lower control arm, the ball joint side or outer connection here, that is 175 Newton meters as well. Once again, 165, 175, 175 for those three. The wheel speed sensor, that's actually 12 Newton meters tightening torque. There is no tightening torque specification on the connection to the level sensor. Tighten that until it breaks and back it off half a turn. You'll be fine. As far as up top, the sway bar end link connection is 56 Newton meters. As we work our way down, we're to the pinch bolt. This is interesting. It's 60 Newton meters and 180 degree offset. Just be wary of this. I have snapped these, a couple of these in the past. Take it easy on this fastener. They're actually designed to fail and fail quite easily. You do not want to over torque this. Just something to be aware of. Okay, let's talk about items that need to be torqued at ride height. The inner bushing for the lower control arm, that's 68 Newton meters at 180 degrees of offset. We're going to go over to the thrust bushing. This bolt is actually 100 Newton meters at 90 degrees of offset. Those two should be tightened at ride height, and I'll get into that more a little bit later. And for some reason, should you need to remove the axle bolt itself is 210 Newton meters and 90 degrees of offset. This bolt should be replaced. Keep in mind that each of the fasteners for the hydro bushing and the bushing for the inner control arm should be refreshed. As for the 4 mounting bolts up top, those are 28 Newton meters and 90 degrees of offset. They should also be refreshed. The only item not previously covered was the nut that goes onto the strut piston and holds the entire assembly together, and that is a 71 Newton meter torque spec. As far as this bolt, there's no actual torque spec for that. I would just make that hand strength. I wouldn't worry about that, and we're good to go. As mentioned, there are a couple of fasteners that should be tightened at ride height, and it's important to understand why. You do not want to tighten those when the suspension is drooped, otherwise you're putting undue stress on the bushings, in this case the hydro bushing as well as the lower control arm inner bushing. And in doing so, those items will wear out quickly. And keep in mind, this hydro bushing is full of hydraulic fluid. You really don't want to ruin or wear out these items prematurely. So what we're going to do is raise the suspension on this corner until the vehicle is coming off of the jack pad. I don't mean completely lifted, I mean just enough that you can move this easily by hand, and it will actually start to make a little bit of noise as I get it near that point. That's what I'm going to do off camera. We can now see the height of the jack stand. I'm going to raise this up a little bit more. We'll get it to where it needs to be, and then we'll tighten those respective fasteners according to their torque specification. As shown, the underhoist jack stand is positioned higher than before. The suspension is at near ride height, and we are prepared to proceed with the next step. In terms of raising the suspension, you will want to elevate the vehicle until it just starts to come off of the jack stand, whether that be a jack stand on the floor or a lift as I'm using here. I'm well aware that this jack pad is split, it needs to be replaced, but what you want to see is the ability to turn this by hand or move this arm. I don't want to do that too much. That's unsafe. Suffice to say, as soon as it starts to come off of the jack pad, that's as far as you need to take it, and you can go back and tighten each respective fastener. Again, we are tightening the thrust arm or hydro bushing at 100 Newton meters and 90 degrees of offset, and we're doing 68 Newton meters on the inner bushing of the lower control arm, and that is 180 degrees offset. I'll do that now. This side of the vehicle is now complete, with the exception of the plastic covers here, as well as back in this position. I'll take care of those momentarily. I'll reinstall the wheel, get it properly torqued, and we will move to the passenger side of the vehicle to continue the project. Take note the position of the lowering spring. The Eibach logo is diagonally pointed to the front corner of the vehicle, as is the part number for the spring. The part number for the springs are the same on both sides of the vehicle, thus they are not side dependent. And that was the case at the rear of the vehicle as well, which is kind of interesting because many things on this vehicle are side and direction specific, such as the rotors front and rear. We are now on the passenger side of the vehicle. I have performed initial disassembly to begin removal of the McPherson strut, and the program on this side is much the same, with the exception of there is no level sensor. You don't have to deal with that on this side of the vehicle. What have I done thus far? Removed this plastic cover, the plastic cover back in this space, disconnected the sway bar end link, disconnected the tie rod. I've also loosened the inner lower control arm bushing. I've loosened the hydro bushing or thrust arm bushing. I've also disconnected all the cables. This is effectively the connectors for the active suspension. And I've also removed the G sensor and placed that aside so it does not get damaged. I've also removed 2 of 4 mounting bolts up top. The 2 that are remaining are slightly loosened, so that gives a little play, a little room to work with. The only thing I have not done is loosen the pinch bolt on the strut itself, and that's next. But before I do that, I will support this assembly with the under hoist jack stand. This is all very straightforward as it was on the driver's side of the vehicle. All the disassembly steps are the same. For me, I've done dozens of lowering spring projects, coilover projects, and just suspension work in general. A lot of it is muscle memory. Even for you, if you're doing this for the first time, you'll have all the proper tools out, the socket sizes, all the things you need, and this side of the vehicle will go much faster. Previously in the video, I provided torque specifications for each respective fastener. However, I did not provide the fastener sizes themselves. Thus, we will do that now. Starting up top on the strut tower, the 4 mounting bolts that hold the McPherson strut in place, those are E12 E-Torx. Moving our way down, this is an E11 E-Torx that holds the G sensor in place. The sway bar end length, that is a 16mm nut, and you're looking at a T30 Torx to hold that in place while backing off or tightening that nut. In terms of the tie rod, that is a 21mm nut, and working our way over to the pinch bolt. The bolt head is 18mm, and over on this side, we have a 16mm nut. In terms of the fasteners for the plastic covers, those are 10mm. In terms of the thrust arm hydro bushing, that is an 18mm bolt head. Underneath, we have the inner bushing for the lower control arm. It is 18mm on both sides. Both the nut and bolt are 18mm. And I believe that covers everything. The under hoist jack stand is now in place. The suspension is slightly compressed, and the next step is to lower the suspension and begin removal of the McPherson strut. I'm not going over each and every step of the process on this side of the vehicle, as we have already covered those items on the driver's side, and the program is much the same. If there's anything that appears different or that I have difficulty with, I'll be sure to cover that later in the video. The passenger side strut is now removed from the vehicle. As with the driver's side, the body of the strut is clean. There's no scuffing, no scarring, scratches or anything. It was a smooth operation, and I am pleased with that. We will now take a look in the wheel well area itself. In terms of the remaining suspension components, everything is properly supported. Other items are loose. The cables, hoses, etc. There's no undue stress on anything. These items are in a good place until we reinstall the McPherson strut with the new lowering spring. We are back on the workbench. The passenger side strut is approaching disassembly. The new spring is ready to install. Again, make sure that the branding and the part number are right side up when installing. I'll also add that it is physically impossible to install this spring upside down. Having said that, I know someone has probably done it, but it's super obvious when things do not go back together correctly. The spring is now compressed. Take notice, compression is minimal. Thus, the spring compressors only require tightening to the extent that tension is relieved from the strut mount, and then you can remove the nut from the piston and begin disassembly. The strut is now disassembled, and once again, I have the factory spring and the new Eibach lowering spring side by side. And as before, the factory spring does not stand up straight. They never do. They always kind of lean to one side, but everything is exactly as we experienced on the first pass. Next up is to install the lowering spring. Again, you do not have to use spring compressors to accomplish this. You can build the strut on a workbench or on the floor, press down with hand strength. You can get the nut started on the piston, and from there it's just a matter of tightening that nut down to 71 Newton meters and you are good to go. We are back in the garage. The passenger side McPherson strut is reassembled. The lowering spring is in place. Everything went exactly as expected and exactly as it did on the driver's side. Take note of the branding and the part number on the spring. They are in the same orientation as on the driver's side, only they're going to be pointing towards the passenger side A-pillar instead of the front fender or bumper. Once again, if you're following this method of installation, be sure to hang the strut first. At this point, I have the strut in place with only 2 mounting bolts. They're loose. The strut is not touching anything, and this will provide plenty of movement for alignment with the strut mount and to raise this back up and get everything snug and in place for reassembly. The under hoist jack stand has been raised. The suspension is at near ride height, and we'll now go ahead and torque the thrust arm, hydro bushing, as well as the lower control arm, the inner bushing. Once again, the vehicle should be raised until it begins to rise off of this jack pad. So I can move this freely, and what I find on this lift as well as others is the diagonally opposing support arm, in this case the driver's side rear wheel, that will begin making noise, like pinging or creaking a little bit as it takes on additional load just before this jack pad breaks contact at the bottom of the vehicle. That is the telltale sign that you've raised the suspension high enough, and if you're doing it on jack stands, the same applies. I'll move ahead and get these fasteners tightened to factory specifications, and we'll move on. As a reminder, the battery will need to be reconnected at the end of the project. I relatched the trunk lid on this vehicle as it is on the lift, and I did not want the trunk to pop open and make contact with the ceiling. So we're going to take a look real quick, and you're going to reach in and you're going to pull that lever to reopen the trunk and access the battery. Suspension work on the passenger side front is now complete. Lowering springs are installed on all 4 corners. The wheels are back in place. And from what I can see, the suspension is not drooping as much in the front or in the rear. That's to be expected. The real question is, how much lower will the vehicle sit once it is on the floor? I did take ride height measurements prior to the spring installation. I'll get the vehicle on the floor now, and we'll see how much lower the vehicle is with the Eibach springs. And it is now time to review the results of the Eibach lowering spring installation. I did take ride height measurements prior to the project. At the front, we had measuring from the ground through the center line of the wheel up to the center line of the fender. We were at 27 1/8 inch, and that was on both sides, which is very unusual. It's rare that you get a vehicle out of the factory that the measurements are dead on, but this vehicle was. And the same was true for the rear, but the rear was at 27 3/8. Again, same on both sides, which is somewhat unusual. In terms of where we're at now, the front is at 26 inches, again, measuring from the ground through the center line of the wheel up to the center line of the fender, 26 inches. At the rear, we're at 26.5. At the front, the vehicle has been lowered 1 1/8 inch. At the rear, the vehicle has been lowered 7/8 of an inch. Now there will be just a slight bit of drop as the suspension settles, but I don't expect that to be very great, as this is a new vehicle. These are new springs. Probably not going to see much out of this. Now be aware there are no spacers on this vehicle, at least not yet. I do plan to do those here in the next few days, probably 12 millimeter on each corner, maybe 10 at the rear, or 12 in the front, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure, but I do have plans to do spacers, which will fill in that gap a little bit more. Again, I am not targeting a slammed look. That's not what I'm looking for. I am looking for a slightly lowered ride, which I have achieved, and I just have to take the vehicle out and drive it to determine if the ride quality and the compliant nature of this vehicle is still there and intact. To conclude the Eibach lowering spring installation project on this 2025 BMW G20 M340i xDrive LCI2 model, I have driven the vehicle and I'm extremely pleased with the results. The vehicle is exactly as I was hoping. Again, I had two primary objectives when performing the installation. The first being a modest drop. I don't want a slammed look. I just want the vehicle a little bit lower than it comes from the factory, and it looks great. I'm very happy with that. And the second objective was improved handling. And we should put this in context. The vehicle comes from the factory with exceptional handling. By lowering the center of gravity, getting the front especially a little bit lower than the factory stance, and it makes a big difference in terms of turn in, and the arc or the radius that this vehicle takes through turns is improved from what you find with the factory setup. The ride is firmer than stock, and for me that's fine. I don't find it uncomfortable. I will be taking long distance trips with this vehicle, as well as doing some backroad spirited driving and possibly an occasional track day or something like that. A really important point to make in this video is the adaptive suspension. I know several folks that have purchased M340i's from 2019 on through the entire model run. Those that have not paid for the option or opted up to get the adaptive suspension on this vehicle, they're usually unhappy with how the vehicle rides. The adaptive suspension is definitely taking the edge off of road imperfections, bumps, potholes, etc. That's something to keep in mind when purchasing this vehicle. Make sure you get the adaptive suspension, unless you're going to build this into some type of track monster. Otherwise, you may not care. It's something that is highly recommended. Other considerations for when doing this project are the front and rear sway bars. You are placing additional load on those items, or specifically the bushings. And the factory bushings are preloaded. They're also glued in place in the front. I'm not sure about the rear, but it's something to be aware of. You're going to wear out those bushings prematurely, and they'll have to be replaced. Keep in mind, this is a brand new vehicle. I'm not too concerned about it right now, but those will have to be replaced at some point. The other thing is the camber. You're adding additional camber in the rear as well as in the front. And in the front, it really stands out, at least in my eyes. Visually, you can see it here. And again, I don't have spacers on this vehicle yet, but I will in time. Actually, I have them in a box. Just a matter of getting them installed. There's definitely more camber in the front end than the before, and it has a remarkable impact on the handling of the vehicle. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the results of the Eibach lowering spring installation. If you have questions, my email address is located in the About section of this channel. I hope this video has been helpful.